There's a quiet hum in every big machine, a rhythm that most folks take for granted, like the ticking heart of something vast and indifferent. And sometimes, you find a man who moves with that hum, so much a part of the gears and levers and the metallic breath of the factory floor that you hardly even see him. He's just another piece of the puzzle, a dependable bolt holding the whole damn thing together. But the truth of it is, the world doesn't turn on grand speeches or the loudest voice in the room. It turns on the steady hands, the knowing eyes, and the quiet resolve of the men and women who show up, day in and day out, whether anyone's watching or not. And sometimes, it's those very hands, those eyes, that hold the power to change everything, to lift not just a lever, but a whole lot of human spirit. If only they knew how to wield it, to see beyond their own piece of the puzzle and connect the scattered parts into something whole. And that man, the one who moved with the quiet hum of the factory, was Garrett. 48 years old, with a name as plain and solid as the steel beams holding up the roof of the plant where he'd punched a clock for longer than most folks on their first car. He wasn't a supervisor, wasn't a manager. He was a factory worker, pure and simple, one of the many hands that kept the complex gears of industry turning day in and day out. You'd see him on the floor, usually by the assembly line, his movements precise and economical. There was no wasted motion in Garrett, no flash. He was like an old, well-oiled machine himself, dependable, consistent, doing the same critical job every minute of every shift. His face was a roadmap of a working life. Lines etched around his eyes from years of squinting under fluorescent lights, a jaw that suggested a man who held his thoughts closer than most. His hands, though, they were the real story. Calloused and strong, knuckles a bit swollen, they looked like they'd wrestled with more than just tools. They debuilt things, fixed things, provided for things. They were the hands of a man who understood the language of hard work, the silent promise of a good grip. And in his eyes, often tired but never vacant, you could sometimes catch a flicker, a depth, a quiet strength that belied his reserved demeanor. He looked like he'd carried burdens, sure, but also like he'd handled every single one of them without complaint. Garrett was the kind of guy who showed up. Always, rain, snow, sleet, or shine, his beat-up pickup truck would be in the employee lot by 6:45 a.m., 30 minutes before his shift officially started. That extra time was for grabbing a coffee, reading the laminated notice board, maybe just settling his mind before the relentless rhythm of the plant took hold. He was quiet, a bit gruff if you tried to engage him in small talk about anything other than the job, and meticulously focused on his tasks. He wasn't one to seek attention, never volunteered for the office party planning committee, never stayed late just to hobnob with the brass. He just did his job, and he did it well. Reliability was his badge of honor, worn without fanfare. He never rocked the boat, didn't see the point. Why stir up trouble when there was good work to be done? But beneath that quiet, solid surface, in the hours when the factory noise faded, and only the hum of the refrigerator broke the silence of his small house, a different Garrett sometimes surfaced. There was a deep-seated desire in him, buried under layers of practicality and duty, to make a difference that went beyond his daily quota. He feared being overlooked, feared being insignificant, a common fear perhaps, but one that resonated particularly sharply for a man who often felt like just another cog. He had a strong sense of loyalty, especially to the guys on his shift, and an unwavering belief in fairness, even when he saw it trampled. And for his two kids, Emily, 16 and full of sharp, teenage wit, and Daniel, 12 and constantly tinkering with something, there was a quiet, desperate hope. A hope that their lives somehow would be easier, less of a grind than his had been. That they wouldn't just be another cog. His strengths were subtle, not flashy. Unwavering persistence, for one. If a problem arose, Garrett would worry at it like a dog with a bone, not giving up until he'd found a solution, usually a practical, no-nonsense one. And despite his gruff exterior, he held a fundamental belief in the good in people, even when it was hidden under layers of frustration or indifference. It was a quiet conviction, one he rarely voiced, but it was there, a steady ember glowing within him. His flaw, though, was just as ingrained. That initial reluctance to speak up, to take charge, was a habit as old as his factory ID badge. He had a way of internalizing problems, chewing on them alone instead of sharing the load, and a fear of disrupting the status quo, even when that status quo was clearly detrimental to everyone involved. He'd seen men speak up before, seen them get burned, and the lesson had stuck. Better to keep your head down, do your job, and let the chips fall where they may. It was safer. It was easier, or so he told himself. Home for Garrett was a modest, single-story house in an older, established working-class neighborhood. Not fancy, but meticulously maintained. The lawn was always cut, the gutters clean, the porch light always working. A place where things were kept in order, just like Garrett liked them. Sarah, his wife, 47, understood him without a lot of words, a rare gift. She knew the weight he carried, the unspoken hopes. She saw past the quiet, knew the man beneath. And the kids, Emily and Daniel, they were his world, his reason for showing up, for enduring. Every bill paid, every car repair, every trip to the grocery store, every late night fixing Daniel's broken bike, every quiet conversation with Emily about school, it was all for them. For their chance at something more. Before his transformation, Garrett was the ultimate follower. Not in a bad way, not lazy or incompetent, just a follower. He did his job, punched his clock, followed orders to the letter. Never questioned authority, never suggested a better way, never volunteered an opinion that wasn't asked for. His belief was simple. Leadership was about being in charge, about issuing commands, and his role was to execute them. He thought empowering others was a manager's job, not his. He was good, damn good, at his own specific tasks, but his mindset built walls around his impact. His efficiency was limited to his own output, his own workstation. He wasn't fostering dependence intentionally, but by always just doing what he was told, by never pushing the envelope, by never asking, "What if?" He inadvertently created a scenario where people waited to be told what to do. The gears turned, yes, but only because he was pushing his own lever, not teaching anyone else how to build a better machine. He was a pillar of the team, absolutely, but a solitary one, standing firm rather than reaching out a hand. The gears turned, yes, but only because he was pushing his own lever, not teaching anyone else how to build a better machine. He was a pillar of the team, absolutely, but a solitary one, standing firm rather than reaching out a hand. Garrett's world began at 5 a.m., 6 days a week. The groan of the old alarm clock was a familiar, unwelcome friend. Not the chirpy digital kind, but a proper, tinny bell that scraped sleep from the edges of his brain. He'd swing his legs out of bed, the floorboards cool beneath his calloused feet, and reach for his worn jeans and a faded work shirt, smelling faintly of fabric softener and machine oil. Sarah would still be asleep beside him, her breathing soft and even, and he'd try not to disturb her, stepping lightly as he navigated the dark hallway of their modest, single-story house. It was a good house, paid for mostly, solid. Like him, downstairs, the kitchen was his domain in those early hours. The hiss of the coffee maker, the smell of dark roast filling the quiet space was a small comfort. He'd pack his lunch, usually a turkey sandwich, an apple, and a handful of pretzels, assembling it with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd done it thousands of times. Emily and Daniel's school bags would be waiting by the door, silent reminders of why he did it all. Each lunch packed, each bill paid, was a small victory in a never-ending war against a world that seemed to demand more and more for less and less. Gas prices, grocery costs, the orthodontist for Emily, it all added up, a tightrope walk every month, leaving little room for error or for dreams. The drive to the plant was a blur of pre-dawn darkness, the same streetlights, the same worn asphalt, the same slow creep of headlights from other early birds heading to their own posts. He'd pull into his usual spot, the faint smell of exhaust fumes and industrial cleaners already hanging in the air. Inside, the factory floor was a symphony of metallic clang and hum, a living, breathing beast he knew intimately. His hands, thick and strong, stained with the grime of years, moved with practiced ease across the machinery. He was good at his job, reliable. He didn't cut corners, didn't slack off. He was one of the few who still knew how to fix the older hydraulic press without calling in a specialist. People counted on him, even if they didn't say it out loud. He saw it in the quick nods, the shared glances, the unspoken trust. But beneath the surface of that reliable, quiet man, a deeper current ran. It wasn't a raging river, more like an underground stream murmuring with unfulfilled desires. Garrett carried the quiet ache of what might have been. He'd always harbored a vague, unformed desire to build something, to create, to see a project through from conception to completion, not just operate one part of it. He saw the blueprints, the designs, but he never got to draw them. He fixed machines, but he never designed them. It was a small thing, this buried dream, not a craving for fame or fortune, but a longing for impact, for something he could point to and say, "I made that." And with that longing came a subtle, persistent fear, the fear of being insignificant, of being just another cog, easily replaced by a younger, faster model, or worse, by automation. He was reliable, yes, but was reliability enough to distinguish him? Was it enough to leave a mark? He watched younger men come and go, full of bluster and ambition, some crashing, some rising, and he wondered if his quiet persistence, his head-down approach, had made him invisible. A good man, a solid worker, but ultimately overlooked. A part of him, a tiny, almost ashamed part, wished he had a bigger voice, a louder presence. But how do you start shouting after 40 years of quiet? He believed in good people. He believed in fairness. And he believed that if everyone just did their part, the system would work. He had learned to internalize problems, to fix things himself, to bear burdens rather than delegate them. It was his way of protecting others, of ensuring things ran smoothly. But sometimes, in the dead of night, lying awake long after Sarah had drifted off, the silent questions would gnaw at him. Was he doing enough? Was he truly making a difference, or was he just enduring? He wanted his kids to have an easier life, yes, but he also wanted them to see a father who stood for something more than just showing up. He worried sometimes that in his quiet reliability, he was teaching them to be invisible too. The gap between the man he was, dutiful and good, and the man he sometimes glimpsed in the quiet corners of his mind, the man who could lead, who could inspire, felt vast and uncrossable. He kept his loyalty firm, his sense of fairness intact, but the silence he embraced was slowly, imperceptibly, suffocating a different kind of strength within him. Garrett's world was the plant floor. He knew the hum of every machine, the rhythm of every shift. He knew the people, too, knew their quirks, their strengths, their breaking points. He saw things, always did, but mostly he just saw and kept working. Then came young Miller. Miller was new, fresh out of some management program, barely old enough to shave properly, and suddenly he was their shift supervisor. Young Miller with his slick-back hair and a nervous twitch that made his eye jump whenever something went wrong, which was often. He was in over his head, plain and simple, and everyone on the floor knew it. Garrett watched him flail. Miller would issue orders that made no sense, changing them halfway through a run, pulling experienced hands off critical tasks to micromanage something trivial. He'd blame the night shift for problems he created on days. He'd freeze up when a real issue arose, staring at the flashing lights or the spilled coolant like it was a foreign language. The energy on the floor, usually a steady, grinding hum of productivity, started to curdle. It began with quiet grumbling around the water cooler. Then it moved to open sighs and eye rolls when Miller walked by. Soon enough, good men Garrett had worked alongside for 15 years, started showing up late, dragging their feet. The pride in their work, that silent understanding that they were building something, even if it was just widgets, began to drain away. Garrett saw it in Jimmy from assembly, a man who once whistled while he worked, now just stared blankly at his hands. He saw it in Maria, who used to joke and tease, now just tight-lipped and distant. He heard the whispers about, looking for other options, the talk about, this place going to hell. Productivity didn't just dip, it nosedived. Orders were delayed, mistakes piled up. One afternoon, a crucial component was overlooked, nearly shutting down an entire line. Miller had been in charge that day, barking contradictory orders, and in the confusion, the component had been missed. It took Garrett and Old Man Johnson, working silent and fast, to jury-rig a temporary fix and keep the line from stalling completely. But the near miss hung in the air like a foul smell. That night, driving home, the usual hum of the engine felt different. It felt heavy. Garrett hadn't said a word to Miller, hadn't questioned his authority, hadn't pointed out the obvious. He just fixed the problem, as he always did. But for the first time, simply fixing the problem didn't feel like enough. It felt like enabling. He saw the fear in Miller's young eyes, yes. But he also saw the defeat in Jimmy's, the resignation in Maria's. And he saw his own reflection in the rearview mirror. A man who had done his job, sure, but who had stood by while good people lost their will, while a good crew slowly fell apart. His head-down approach, once a source of quiet strength, suddenly felt like an act of profound weakness. His inaction wasn't just not helping, it was actively contributing to the rot. He was holding up his corner, but the whole damn house was crumbling around him, and he hadn't so much as uttered a peep. The key in his hand felt like a lead weight. The door opened to the familiar scent of Sarah's cooking, the distant sounds of Emily watching TV, Daniel probably glued to a game. He ate dinner, tried to make small talk, but the food tasted like ash. Sarah looked at him, her brow furrowed. "Rough day, hun?" she asked, her voice soft with concern. He just grunted, "Same as always." But it wasn't. Nothing was the same. He went to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. The clock radio glowed 3:17 a.m. Sarah was a steady, warm presence beside him, her breathing even. He slipped out of bed, careful not to wake her, and went to the living room. The worn armchair by the window was his usual spot for these restless nights. The streetlights cast long, ghostly shadows on the quiet road. A dog barked far off. The silence in the house pressed in on him. He sat there, staring into the dark, and finally there was no escaping it. No more burying it under layers of routine, no more excusing it with, "just doing my part." What had his life become? He had always prided himself on being reliable, the man you could count on. But what kind of reliability was it if it meant watching the people he respected suffer? What kind of strength was it if it meant remaining silent when things were clearly going wrong? He had spent decades believing leadership was about titles, about being the one at the top. He'd seen plenty of those leaders, giving orders, taking credit. He'd never wanted that. He just wanted to do his work, provide for his family, live a decent life. But in that silent, brutal early morning, he saw the flaw in that belief. His quiet strength, his unwavering persistence, his practical problem-solving, these weren't just tools for his own output. They were gifts he had kept hidden, selfishly almost, for fear of rocking the boat, for fear of drawing attention. He thought of Emily with her bright, questioning eyes, of Daniel already trying to figure out how everything worked, always tinkering. What example was he setting? A man who saw injustice, incompetence, and just kept his mouth shut. A man who watched a ship sink and just made sure his own bucket was bailing water, never once thinking to tell the captain the hull was breached. The fear of being overlooked, that old demon, now seemed trivial compared to the fear of being insignificant, not in the eyes of others, but in his own. He wanted his kids to have an easier life, sure. But more than that, he wanted them to have a father who was proud of the man he was, a father who stood for something. Not a follower just because it was easier or because it kept the peace. The quiet hope for his kids, the one that burned deep inside him, demanded more. It demanded he stop being just a cog and start being a lever. The truth, raw and cutting, hit him. He hadn't just been following orders. He had been complicit. His silence, his inaction, it had spoken volumes. And what it had said was, "This is fine. Keep doing what you're doing. I'll just pick up the pieces." It wasn't fine. Nothing about it was fine. And he couldn't pretend it was any more. The exhaustion that settled over him wasn't just physical. It was a profound weariness of the soul, a weariness born from years of quiet compromise. He closed his eyes, the darkness behind his lids as vast and empty as the street outside. For the first time, the path he had always walked, the path of keeping his head down and doing his part, felt utterly, completely wrong. He was tired of just enduring. He was tired of just getting by. He was tired of being invisible, even to himself. The early morning chill that seeped through the window pane felt like a physical representation of the emptiness inside him. Garrett had spent his whole life navigating by a simple compass. Keep your head down, do your work, provide for your family. And now, at 48 years old, that compass was spinning wildly, pointing nowhere he recognized. He couldn't go back to sleep. There was no going back to anything. He lay there, not moving, just breathing, the rhythm of his own lungs, a dull, insistent drum in the quiet house. Enough, he thought, the word a small, firm pebble dropped into the vast, silent well of his consciousness. Not enough frustration, not enough anger. Just enough. Enough of this silent surrender. Enough of watching good people get ground down by bad decisions and his own willingness to look away. He didn't know what enough meant, not exactly. Didn't have a plan. Didn't have a speech written. He just knew with a certainty that reached into his bones that he couldn't keep doing what he'd always done. He couldn't keep being the man who simply picked up the pieces. His kids deserved better. His wife deserved better. He deserved better. The digital alarm on the nightstand glowed 4:45 a.m. Too early. Yet he swung his legs over the side of the bed. The floorboards creaked under his weight, a familiar protest. He walked to the kitchen, the linoleum cool against his bare feet, poured himself a glass of water, stared out the window at the pre-dawn gloom, the faint glow of the streetlights painting the edges of the maple tree. The world was still asleep, but something inside him had woken up. And it was hungry, not for food, but for something he couldn't name, something real. The factory hummed with its usual mechanical symphony when Garrett punched in that morning. The air was thick with the scent of hot metal and grease. He walked past the usual faces, nodding hello, but his gaze was different, sharper. He saw the slumped shoulders of old man Jenkins wrestling with a jammed conveyor, the frustration etched on his face. He saw young Marco, still green, fumbling with the settings on the new hydraulic press, clearly intimidated. Before, Garrett would have walked past Jenkins, maybe offered a grunted, "Rough one, eh?" Then gone to his own station. For Marco, he might have sighed, walked over, fixed the settings himself in 2 seconds and said, "Watch how I do it next time, kid." Inadvertently, he'd be reinforcing the idea that he had the answers and they just needed to watch him. But today, Enough, echoed in his head. He watched Marco for a long moment, the young man's brow furrowed in concentration, his movements hesitant. It would be quicker, easier to just step in, to fix it. The old habit tugged hard, a familiar, comfortable chain. He felt the pull to keep his head down, to just do his job. That was the path of least resistance, the path he'd walked for decades. His stomach tightened. This was harder than he'd imagined. He took a slow, deep breath, tasting the metallic air. This wasn't about him being efficient anymore. It was about something else entirely. He walked over to Marco. "Having some trouble with that, son?" Garrett's voice was low, devoid of judgment. Marco jumped, startled, then nodded. "Yeah, Mr. Garrett, can't seem to get the pressure right, keeps reading low." He gestured helplessly at the panel. Instead of reaching for the controls, Garrett just stood there, hands in his pockets, leaning slightly against the workbench. "Tell me what you've tried so far," he said. It wasn't a command or even a suggestion. It was an invitation, an unheard question hung in the air. "What if I don't just give you the answer? What if I help you find it yourself?" It felt strange, foreign, but he held his ground. This was the first step, and it felt like walking across broken glass. Marco started, then squinted at the pressure gauge again, running through the sequence he'd been taught. "Well, I checked the line for clogs, that was clear. Then I replaced the sensor, thought maybe it was faulty, but it's still reading low. I adjusted the regulator, but it just drops back down." He finished with a frustrated sigh, looking at Garrett for the expected solution. Garrett listened, really listened to each step. It felt like holding back a sneeze, the urge to just blurt out the answer. His brain, honed by decades of troubleshooting, already had 3 possibilities lined up. But he bit his tongue. "You've done some good work there, son," he said, his voice slow and steady. The line, replaced the sensor, adjusted the regulator. "You thought about what else could affect pressure besides those usual suspects?" Marco frowned, scratching his head. He looked at the system, then at Garrett, his mind clearly sifting through possibilities. Garrett didn't prompt him, just stood there, a silent, steady anchor. The hum of the machinery filled the space. It felt like an eternity, but it was probably only 30 seconds. Then Marco's eyes widened. "The seal!" He practically yelled, pointing to a small gasket near the intake valve. "If that's worn, it'd cause a slow leak, right? Pressure'd never build up." Garrett nodded, a small, almost imperceptible dip of his chin. "Could be. Only one way to find out." Marco practically sprang into action, retrieving a new gasket, his movements now confident, purposeful. He replaced it, tightened the bolts, and watched the gauge. Slowly, steadily, the needle climbed, settling precisely where it needed to be. A triumphant grin spread across his face. He looked at Garrett, genuine pride beaming. "It was the seal, Mr. Garrett. Thanks." Garrett just gave another small nod. "You found it, Marco. Good job." He walked away, not lingering for praise, not taking credit. A strange warmth bloomed in his chest, different from the satisfaction of a job quickly done. This felt deeper, more fragile too. Like he'd just opened a door to a whole lot more work. The next few days were a grind. Day 3, Garrett tried the same approach with another young fella, Billy, struggling with a calibration. Billy was less receptive, more accustomed to being told what to do. "Just tell me the damn numbers, Garrett," he grumbled, rubbing a hand over his tired face. "Shift's almost over." The old Garrett would have, out of expediency, out of habit. "But enough," echoed. "Nah, Billy." Garrett said, his voice flat but firm. "Show me what the manual says. Let's walk through it." It took twice as long. Garrett could feel the time ticking away, could almost hear Tim, the new supervisor, in his ear about efficiency. He saw Billy's frustration, saw the flicker of annoyance in his eyes. He felt the familiar weight of wanting to just fix it, to make the problem disappear quickly. His own shift numbers, he knew, would take a hit if he kept this up. That nagging fear of being overlooked, of being seen as less productive, pricked at him. It was a battle not just against habit, but against the very system he'd operated in for so long. But he held on, pushing through Billy's resistance, guiding him step by agonizing step until Billy finally, grudgingly, got the calibration right. The "thanks" was mumbled, but it was there. Barely. By day 7, Garrett was exhausted, mentally more than physically. It was like trying to steer a freight train with a rowboat oar. He'd spent almost an hour with an older worker, Frank, who insisted, "That newfangled setup ain't right." Garrett had tried to guide Frank through the logic, to let him figure out the flaw in his own reasoning, but Frank was dug in. He just wanted Garrett to confirm his own stubborn belief. The discussion had gone nowhere. Garrett felt the frustration rising, the futility of it all. What was he even doing? This wasn't helping anyone. It was just slowing things down, making him feel like an idiot and probably making people resent him. Then the main assembly line jammed. Big one. production screeched to a halt. Tim, the young supervisor, was practically running in circles, barking orders, getting in everyone's way. "Garrett, what's the holdup? Get that line moving. We're losing minutes here." Panic flared in Garrett. The old instinct, the trained response, roared to life. Saw the tangled mess, the specific bolt that had sheared, the exact sequence of steps to clear it. Without thinking, without a word, he grabbed the tools, moved through the chaotic crowd, and in less than 5 minutes had the line purged, cleared, and ready to restart. He'd worked purely on reflex muscle memory kicking in. The line hummed back to life. Tim breathed a visible sigh of relief, and Garrett, adrenaline fading, felt a cold knot in his stomach. He'd done it. He'd fixed it. Quickly. Efficiently, the old way, and it felt like a total failure. He'd seen young Mark, a new hire, standing nearby, eyes wide, clearly confused by the chaos. Mark had been the perfect person to involve, to teach, to show how to diagnose such a common issue. But Garrett had just taken over. He de-solved the problem for them, not with them. He just reinforced the idea that when the chips were down, they just waited for Garrett to fix it. He saw the fleeting look on Mark's face, not admiration, but a kind of resigned dependency. That look twisted something inside him. That night, alone at the kitchen table after Sarah and the kids were asleep, he nursed a cold cup of coffee. The fluorescent hum of the plant still echoed in his head. He thought about Mark's face. He thought about Frank's stubborn refusal. He thought about his own surge of panic, the way he'd reverted to the comfortable, efficient, but ultimately limiting habit. He'd been so good at the old way, so effective, so useless in the long run. He slumped forward, elbows on the chipped formica, rubbing his temples. Maybe this was a fool's errand. Maybe he just wasn't cut out for it. Maybe he was just an old dog too set in his ways. The plant needed doers, not talkers. It needed people to just get the job done. But he remembered Tim's overwhelmed face, the steady drain on morale, the good people on the verge of quitting. He remembered Daniel's bright, hopeful eyes asking about his day, Emily's quiet, growing anxiety about the future. His inaction was part of the problem. His quick fix had only papered over the cracks, not strengthened the foundation. He took a ragged breath. No, not a fool's errand. It was just harder than he thought. He had failed today, yes, but he hadn't quit, and that was the difference. He hadn't given up on the idea. He just needed to figure out how to be persistent in a different way, to learn to push through his own ingrained reactions, even when the pressure mounted. His strength, his unwavering persistence, wasn't just for turning wrenches anymore. It was for turning himself. By day 14, a quiet resolve had settled over him, like the fine dust that coated everything in the factory, settling slowly but surely. Still struggling, still catching himself mid-sentence, still fighting the urge to just show, just tell. But he was getting better at holding back. He'd started to see the small victories. Young Mark, the one he'd let down on the assembly line, had approached him earlier that day. "Mr. Garrett," he'd said, a touch of hesitation in his voice, "that bolt that sheared last week. I was thinking if we had a regular check on the torque settings for those, maybe it wouldn't happen as often." Garrett had looked at him, really looked at him. Not a complaint, not a request for a solution, a suggestion, a thought, a nascent leader testing the waters. "That's a good thought, Mark," Garrett had said, a genuine smile, small but visible, touching his lips. "What do you think we should do about it?" Mark blinked, surprised. He'd expected an answer, or at least a nod of agreement, not another question. He shifted his weight, looking down at his worn boots, then back at Garrett. "Well, I guess we could check right? Like at the start of every shift. Maybe just those critical ones." Garrett nodded slowly, a small spark of approval in his eyes. "And who would do that, Mark? How would we make sure it gets done? And what if the wrench ain't calibrated right?" The questions kept coming, not like an interrogation, but like someone showing him the path, one stone at a time. Mark started talking, hesitantly at first, then gaining confidence as he outlined a simple checklist. A schedule even suggested talking to maintenance about tool calibration. By the end, Mark was buzzing, proud of the solution he had helped craft. Garrett just listened, chiming in only to gently push him deeper, to consider angles he might have missed. Others started to notice. Not Garrett's actions directly, at least not at first. They noticed the change in themselves or in their coworkers. Young Maria, who used to freeze up when a machine jammed, now calmly walked through the troubleshooting steps, muttering Garrett's quiet advice under her breath. "Slow down. Look at the inputs. What changed?" She even started explaining it to new hires, patiently, just like Garrett had taught her. The whispers in the break room changed from complaints about Dave, the overwhelmed supervisor, to discussions about tricky parts or how to optimize a process. Dave himself, still largely oblivious, felt a subtle shift in the air. Fewer urgent calls to him, fewer outright arguments on the floor. When he did walk through, he saw people actually talking to each other, not just passing orders or griping. He saw them working, yes, but also collaborating, sharing knowledge. He'd catch a glimpse of Garrett, leaning against a workbench, watching a younger worker figure something out, a faint, almost imperceptible nod of encouragement on his face. Dave couldn't put his finger on it, but the weight on his own shoulders felt just a fraction lighter. The daily dread hadn't vanished, but it had a new, unfamiliar tint of hope. Weeks melted into a month, then 2. Garrett was still the same man on the surface. Same worn work boots, same grease stains on his shirt, same quiet demeanor. But if you looked into his eyes now, you'd see it. Not just the depth of quiet strength, but a light, a purpose that hadn't been there before. He walked differently, too. Not with a swagger, but with an intentionality, a grounded presence. The factory floor, once a collection of individual cogs, slowly became something more like a living organism. When a new, complex order came in instead of the usual scramble and confusion, Garrett didn't jump in to direct. He pulled a few key team members aside, Mark, Maria, old Frank who'd been there forever but never spoke up, and laid out the problem. "This ain't gonna be easy," he'd say, "but we got the best minds for this. How do we break it down? Who sees a bottleneck? Who's got an idea for the timing?" He fostered a discussion, letting solutions emerge from the collective wisdom, only interjecting to clarify, to connect an idea to a different department, or to gently challenge a superficial thought until they dug deeper. He wasn't just solving problems anymore, he was building problem solvers. He wasn't just getting the work done, he was creating a team that could get the work done without him, or even better than him. He taught them to trust their instincts, to question processes, to see themselves as vital parts of the solution, not just hands following instructions. He made sure their voices were heard, carrying their suggestions to Dave not as his own, but as the team's idea to improve X, giving them the credit, the ownership. At home, Sarah noticed it most. He was still tired after a long day, but the weariness was different. It wasn't the defeated slump of a man just surviving. It was the honest fatigue of someone who had invested himself, body and soul, into something meaningful. He'd talk about the team, about how Mark came up with a clever jig, or how Maria trained the new guy on the press. There was pride in his voice, not for his own achievements, but for theirs. His kids, Emily and Daniel, saw it too. He listened more, offered advice not as dictates, but as observations, encouraging them to think for themselves. He was showing them, through his own actions, what it meant to stand tall. One evening, sitting on the porch swing as the sun dipped below the power lines, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Sarah asked him, "You seem lighter, Garrett. What changed?" He looked out at the quiet street, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Used to think being a leader meant you had all the answers and everyone just did what you said, like a foreman on a crew. You're the boss, you got the blueprint, they just follow." He paused, reflecting. "But it ain't, not really. What I learned, it's about helping folks find their own answers. It's about getting them strong enough so they don't need you telling them what to do all the time, like planting a garden. You can water it, tend to it, make sure it gets sun. But you don't make the flowers bloom, you just create the conditions for them to do it themselves." He turned to Sarah, his eyes earnest. "Real leadership, that's just mackin'. Sure, everyone else can stand tall too. Give them the tools, then get out of their way. It ain't about mackin' followers, Sarah. It's about mackin' more leaders. Ones who can pick up the shovel when you're not there, or even when you are, and dig their own path." And so the quiet man in the factory, the one who once kept his head down and just followed, didn't become a boss with a fancy title. He became something far more powerful. He became a foundation, a catalyst. He became the living proof that a true leader doesn't cast a long shadow. He casts a wide net, pulling others up with him, creating a